Let's get started. Story number 1.
The town of Maplewood had always been a quiet, unassuming place, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a steady, predictable pace. But for the Maplewood High School football team, this quiet little town was the site of one of the most unsettling mysteries the school had ever known. It all started with the hiring of Coach Danvers. He was a man with a reputation, a hard-nosed, no-nonsense coach who had turned struggling programs into state champions. Maplewood's previous coach had retired, and the school board decided that it was time to bring in someone who could lead the team to greatness. Coach Danvers seemed like the perfect choice. He was experienced, driven, and eager to prove himself. He quickly made an impact, turning the once mediocre Maplewood Mustangs into a well-coached, highly disciplined squad. But even with his expertise, Coach Danvers struggled to connect with his players. They were an odd mix of veterans and newcomers with a talent for the game but little in the way of leadership. There was one player, in particular, that Coach Danvers couldn't understand, a senior wide receiver named Alex Carson. Alex had been one of the team's star players, but lately he had been acting strangely. He would arrive at practice late, his eyes hollow and tired. He seemed distracted, often staring off into the distance as if seeing something no one else could. Coach Danvers tried to address it, pulling Alex aside during practices, but the young man would always brush him off with vague answers. It wasn't just his behavior on the field that was concerning. Alex's home life was a mystery to most of the team. He had no parents, or at least no one ever spoke of them. His grandparents had raised him, but they too were seldom seen. Alex lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, a place that had been in his family for generations. No one knew much about the house, except that it had an old, eerie feel to it. The windows were always shut tight, and the grass in the yard seemed to grow a little too wild. It was a house that people avoided, not out of fear, but because of the unsettling aura that seemed to radiate from it. One afternoon, after a grueling practice, Coach Danvers decided to pay Alex a visit. He was concerned, and he needed to get to the bottom of whatever was bothering his star player. He drove out to Alex's house, the old roads winding through the trees, the sun beginning to set in the distance. When Coach Danvers arrived, the house looked just as he expected, gloomy and untouched by time. There was no sign of life, no movement behind the curtains. He knocked on the door, his hand pausing for a moment as the sound echoed through the stillness. After a long wait, the door creaked open. Alex stood there, his face pale, his hair unkempt. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Coach?" Alex's voice was a little hoarse, as if he hadn't used it much. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you," Coach Danvers replied. "You've been acting off lately, and I think we need to talk." Alex stepped aside, reluctantly allowing his coach into the house. The inside was as eerie as the outside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of something old and musty lingered. The walls were covered with black and white photos of men in old football uniforms, their faces stern and determined. There was a large fireplace in the corner, but the house was cold, almost too cold for the time of year. "I've been fine, Coach," Alex said, his voice distant. He motioned for Coach Danvers to sit, but the coach hesitated. The atmosphere in the room was unsettling, and he felt as if he were intruding on something far deeper than a simple conversation. "Alex," Coach Danvers said, "this isn't just about football anymore. You're not yourself lately. You're not the player I know." Alex hesitated, his eyes flickering to the side. "I don't know what's happening to me, Coach. I can't explain it." Coach Danvers studied the young man, seeing something in his eyes that made his skin crawl. It was fear, a raw, palpable fear that Alex couldn't hide. The coach sat forward in his chair. "What's going on, Alex?" Alex took a deep breath. He stood up, pacing the room as he spoke. "It's this house," he said finally. "It's been in my family for generations, but it's not like any normal house. There's something wrong with it." Coach Danvers was skeptical. He had heard all sorts of stories in small towns like this, local legends, superstitions, but he didn't believe in ghosts or curses. Not really. "What do you mean? What's wrong with it?" Alex stopped pacing and turned to face Coach Danvers, his expression serious. "I've been seeing things," Alex admitted. "At first, I thought it was just me, stress or something, but it's not. There's a figure, a man in an old football uniform. He's been watching me, and every time I see him, I feel this pressure, like I'm supposed to do something, like I'm being pushed to finish something that was never finished. Coach Danvers felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do you mean? Finish something? Alex's gaze darkened. I don't know, but it's like I'm cursed, like I'm carrying something with me, something from the past. Coach Danvers didn't know what to say. He could see that Alex truly believed what he was saying, but it sounded ridiculous. But there was something in the air, something about the house that was making him uncomfortable. Why didn't you tell anyone about this before? Coach Danvers asked. Alex sighed, looking down at his hands. Because I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. But it's getting worse. The figure, it's becoming more real. Sometimes I feel like I can hear him whispering in my ear, urging me to play, to win, to finish what was started. Coach Danvers stood up slowly, his mind racing. Alex, this is a football game. It's not a curse. Whatever this is, it's in your head. But Alex shook his head vehemently. No, Coach. It's real. I've seen him, and if I don't do what he wants, something bad will happen. Coach Danvers didn't know how to respond. He looked at the young man whose eyes were wide with fear. Maybe you should take a break from football for a while, Coach Danvers suggested. Get some rest. See a doctor. But Alex wasn't listening. His eyes had become fixated on something in the corner of the room. His body stiffened, and his breath quickened. Coach Danvers turned to see what Alex was staring at, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of the room growing longer as the sun set. I have to go, Alex whispered, his voice shaking. He's here. He's watching me. Before Coach Danvers could say another word, Alex rushed to the door, slamming it behind him. The coach stood there, unsure of what to do next. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though something was lurking just beyond his reach. The next day, the team gathered for practice. Coach Danvers tried to push the strange events from his mind, focusing on the task at hand, but the unease never left him. As the players ran drills, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sky was clouded over, and a wind had begun to pick up, making the practice feel colder than it should have been. At one point during a scrimmage, Alex took the field. He looked different. His eyes were glazed over, and he seemed almost possessed. He moved with a strange intensity, as if he were playing not for the team, but for something else. Coach Danvers watched in horror as Alex ran a route, sprinting toward the end zone. The ball was thrown his way, but just as he reached out to catch it, something happened. The lights on the field flickered violently, then went out. The entire stadium was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then a scream echoed across the field. When the lights came back on, Alex was gone. The entire field was empty, save for the other players standing in confusion. Coach Danvers rushed to the middle of the field, calling Alex's name. But there was no answer. He never saw Alex again. Some say that night, Alex became another lost soul, trapped by the curse of the game that was never finished. The figure that Alex had spoken of was never seen again, but the stories persist. The Maplewood Mustangs never played the same after that season, and the school eventually dismantled the football program altogether, unable to shake the strange events that had unfolded. The house still stands on the outskirts of town, shrouded in mystery, with no one willing to approach it. Some say that if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can hear the faint sound of footsteps, someone or something running the field. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The autumn air carried a sharp chill across the small Texas town of Hollis, where Friday night football was more than just a game. It was a way of life. The entire town gathered under the glow of stadium lights every week to watch their team, the Hollis Creek Wildcats, battle on the gridiron. It had been that way for generations. But there was one part of the Wildcats' history that people refused to talk about. One game that no one liked to remember. And one name that still carried a whispered warning: Daniel Reese. It had been 20 years since Daniel had played for the Wildcats, a star running back with dreams of making it big. He was fast, unstoppable on the field, and destined for a scholarship that would take him out of Hollis. Everyone believed he would be the one to put their little town on the map. Until that night. It was homecoming. The Wildcats were locked in a brutal game against their biggest rivals, the Granton Bulls. The game was tied, and the Wildcats had one final drive to seal the win. With only seconds left, the ball was handed to Daniel. He broke through the line, cut past two defenders, and sprinted toward the end zone. Then he was gone. Not tackled, not injured, just gone. 1 second, he was running full speed, and the next, the mist that had settled over the field swallowed him whole. The crowd gasped, the players froze, and the referees blew their whistles in confusion. Coaches and teammates ran to where Daniel had been, expecting to see him lying somewhere in the fog. But he wasn't there. The game never resumed. The search for Daniel lasted weeks. The police, the town, even the state authorities combed every inch of the field and surrounding areas. But there was no sign of him, no footprints leading away, no clothing, no blood. Just nothing. Some believed he had run away. Others thought something far worse had happened, though no one could explain how a player could simply vanish in front of an entire stadium. Officially, he was declared missing. Unofficially, Daniel Reese became the town's darkest secret. The Wildcats finished the season, but something had changed. The team never played the same. They started losing more than they won. The field, once a place of pride, became something else entirely. A place people feared. Strange things started happening. Lights flickering during practice. Players hearing their names whispered in the locker room when no one was there. Shadows moving across the field when it should have been empty. And then there was the mist. It didn't come every night, but when it did, it came thick, creeping across the field like a living thing. It moved unnaturally, swirling in strange patterns, always drifting toward the same end zone, the one Daniel had been running toward the night he disappeared. Some of the older coaches believed the field had taken him, that something unnatural lived beneath the turf, waiting, but no one could prove anything. By the time 20 years had passed, most of the students didn't know the full story. The new generation only heard whispers, distorted versions of the truth. They didn't believe in ghosts or curses until it happened again. Jace Holloway wasn't from Hollis. His family had moved from Houston after his father got a job at the local oil refinery. He didn't know the town's history, didn't know about Daniel Reese. All he knew was that he had the talent to play football and a chance to lead the Wildcats to the playoffs for the first time in years. The team wasn't great, but they had heart. And Jace, he had speed. It was the night of the homecoming game, just like it had been 20 years ago. The Wildcats were, once again, facing the Granton Bulls. And just like before, the score was tied in the final minutes. The mist rolled in right on schedule. Jace stood on the sideline, shifting his weight from foot to foot, waiting for the coach's call. The fog was heavier than usual, clinging to the grass like a second layer of turf. He wiped the sweat from his face, ignoring the way his breath curled unnaturally in the air. It was 4th down. They needed 10 yards. The plan was simple: get the ball in Jace's hands and let him do what he did best. Run. The crowd was a blur of sound as he took his place in the backfield, heart pounding in his chest. The quarterback called the play, the ball was snapped, and everything slowed down. Jace took the handoff and cut left. A defender lunged, but he juked past him easily. Another dived at his legs, but he leaped over the tackle, sprinting toward open space. The end zone was just ahead, and then the world around him changed. The cheers of the crowd faded into eerie silence. The stadium lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. The mist thickened, pressing in from all sides. Then he felt it. The air shifted behind him, the unmistakable sensation of someone, chasing him, but there was no sound of footsteps, no breathing, just a presence. Jace ran harder. His lungs burned, his legs pumped, but the end zone felt impossibly far away. He could see it. He was almost there. Then something grabbed his ankle. It wasn't a tackle. It wasn't a stumble. It was a hand, cold, strong. It locked around his leg, yanking him backward. Jace hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. His head snapped up, desperate to see who had stopped him. There was no one there, only the mist. And then movement, a shadow within the fog. A shape, humanoid, but wrong. It flickered like a distorted image, half seen and impossible to focus on. But he saw the number on its jersey. Number 22, Daniel Reese. Jace's breath came in ragged gasps as he scrambled to his feet. He could hear voices now, distant, warped like they were coming from underwater. Then Daniel spoke. "You don't belong here." Jace's blood ran cold. The grip on his ankle tightened, harder, pulling him down. Jace kicked, thrashed, fought against the unseen force. His fingers clawed at the grass, tearing up chunks of dirt as he struggled to break free. Then, light. Blinding stadium lights flashed overhead, the sound of the crowd roaring back into existence. The fog dissipated instantly. Jace was lying just outside the end zone, the football rolling harmlessly away from him. The game was over. The Wildcats had lost. His teammates ran toward him, faces filled with confusion and concern. They had seen him fall, seen him flail on the ground like he was fighting something that wasn't there. Jace could barely breathe. He never played football again after that night, and the mist, it still comes. Every homecoming game. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain had started just after sundown, a steady drizzle that turned the football field at Grayson High into a slick, muddy battleground. The last game of the season was only a week away, and for the seniors, it was their final chance to prove themselves. Coach Daniels refused to cancel practice. "A little rain never killed anyone," he barked as the players lined up for their final set of drills. "Now, I don't care how tired you are. I want you to give me everything you got." Ethan Carter, the team's quarterback, wiped rain from his face and adjusted his grip on the ball. The Wolverines were down a few players due to injuries, and with the biggest game of the year coming up, they needed every bit of practice they could get. But something about tonight felt wrong. The stadium lights cast eerie shadows on the field, and the rain made everything hazy. Beyond the end zone, just past the chain link fence, the woods stretched into the distance. Ethan had grown up hearing the stories about those woods. How, back in the 70s, a player named Lucas Grady had died on this very field during a game and had been buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the forest. Most people in town dismissed it as just a ghost story, something older kids told freshmen to mess with them. But there were always whispers. Stories of strange figures seen near the bleachers late at night, of cold spots in the locker room, of a voice calling players' names when no one was there. Ethan had never believed in any of it, until tonight. He lined up behind center, waiting for the snap. As soon as the ball was in his hands, he dropped back, scanning for an open receiver. Just as he wound up to throw, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, just beyond the fence, near the woods. A figure, dressed in a mud-streaked football uniform. Ethan hesitated for half a second, and in that moment, his right tackle was shoved back into him, knocking him off balance. He barely had time to brace before he hit the wet turf hard. "Damn it, Carter!" Coach Daniels shouted. "Keep your head in the game!" Ethan sat up, heart hammering in his chest, and looked back toward the fence. The figure was gone. Later that night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. It had only been for a second, but he knew it hadn't been a trick of the light. The uniform had looked old, faded, like something from a different era. He was still thinking about it when he reached his locker in the nearly empty locker room. Most of the team had already left, and only a few guys remained, finishing up showers or grabbing their gear. The air was thick with steam, the fluorescent lights humming softly. Ethan turned the lock on his locker and yanked the door open. Inside, sitting neatly on the shelf, was a single football helmet, not his. It was old. The paint chipped, the face mask slightly bent. Mud still clung to it in places, as if it had just been dug up from the ground. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen this helmet before. He sure as hell hadn't put it in his locker. A whisper, barely audible over the distant sound of the showers running. "Ethan." The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned sharply, expecting to see one of his teammates messing with him, but the locker room was empty. "Ethan." This time, the voice came from right behind him. He spun around, and for the briefest moment, he saw him, Lucas Grady. Standing in the aisle between the lockers, his uniform torn and filthy, his eyes sunken and hollow. Then the lights flickered, and he was gone. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing. The helmet in his locker suddenly felt like it was burning a hole in his vision. Without thinking, he grabbed it and shoved it into his duffel bag before slamming his locker shut and running out of the building. That night, Ethan barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the ghostly figure. The helmet sat on his desk, untouched. He didn't know why he had taken it. He should have left it there. At some point in the night, as he tossed and turned in bed, he thought he heard something. A faint sound, like the distant echo of a crowd. A whistle blowing, a cheer going up. He sat up, his pulse hammering. The sounds faded, but the air in his room was freezing. The next day, Ethan did what any rational person would do. He tried to convince himself that he had imagined everything, that stress and exhaustion were messing with his head. But when he got to school, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. "Yo, Carter, you good?" Jake Monroe, the team's wide receiver, nudged him at lunch. "Yeah," Ethan lied. "You looked like you saw a ghost last night." Jake laughed, shoving a fry into his mouth. Ethan forced a chuckle. "Something like that." By the time practice rolled around again, Ethan had convinced himself that he had just been freaked out. But as soon as he stepped onto the field, the feeling came rushing back. It started during warm-ups. Every time he glanced toward the woods, he thought he saw something, a shape moving just beyond the trees. Then, during scrimmage, he dropped back for a pass and saw the figure again, this time standing on the sidelines, watching. Ethan panicked. He hesitated a second too long, and before he could throw, he was blindsided by a linebacker. His head slammed against the turf, and everything went black. When he came to, he was standing on the field. But it wasn't Grayson High's field. This one was different. The grass overgrown, the bleachers rusted, a thick fog clung to the ground. The stadium lights flickered. And standing in front of him, staring with those hollow eyes, was Lucas Grady. "You have to finish the game," the ghost whispered. "You have to win." Ethan tried to speak, but his mouth felt full of dirt. The field seemed to shift beneath his feet. Suddenly, he was in the middle of a game. But the players around him weren't his teammates. Their uniforms were old, tattered. They looked like they had been buried underground for decades. The whistle blew, and everything surged forward. Ethan ran, the ball in his hands, ghostly figures charging toward him. He dodged one, then another. He could hear the roar of a phantom crowd. Then he saw Lucas, wide open. Ethan didn't think. He threw. The ball spiraled through the air, cutting through the fog. Lucas caught it. The second his fingers touched the ball, the stadium lights exploded, and a deafening roar filled Ethan's ears. He woke up on the sideline, Coach Daniels and his teammates standing over him. "You okay, Carter?" Coach asked. Ethan sat up, dazed. What happened?" "You took a nasty hit. You were out for a minute." Ethan swallowed hard. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in mud, but not from the field, from something older, deeper. That night when he got home, he found the helmet on his desk again, but this time the mud was gone, and carved into the side, barely visible, were two words: "Thank you." Ethan never saw the ghost of Lucas Grady again, but every time he stepped onto that field, he felt the weight of history beneath his feet, and he knew. Some games never really end. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The sun had long since set over the small town of Ellenville, its orange and pink hues now a faint memory behind the hills that surrounded the town. The last few stragglers from the local high school football game were trickling out of the stadium, laughing and chatting as they made their way to their cars. The echo of a distant whistle still hung in the air, but soon even that would fade, leaving only the quiet hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. The football field had been the pride of Ellenville High for decades, its worn-out bleachers and cracked pavement a testament to years of passionate games, championship wins, and heart-wrenching losses. But there was something about the stadium that always felt different, something unsettling that no one could quite put their finger on. Marcus had played on that field for 4 years, first as a wide receiver and then as quarterback in his senior year. He had always heard the whispers, of course, the stories about strange happenings late at night after the games were over. People spoke of eerie sounds coming from the empty stands, of lights flickering when no one was around, of the faint, echoing sound of a whistle when no one was there to blow it. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts, though. He had always been the type to dismiss such stories as mere superstition, the kind of thing that small towns were all too eager to embrace when they had little else to do. But that all changed the night he had to go back to the field. It was late, a Saturday night, 2 days after their final game of the season. The school was hosting a small postseason celebration in the gym, and the team had been invited to attend. But Marcus wasn't in the mood to celebrate. He was tired, emotionally drained from the game, and simply wanted to go home and sleep. He had been about to leave when Coach Anderson, a gruff, no-nonsense man in his mid-50s, stopped him in the hallway outside the gym. "Marcus, I need you to go back to the field and check something for me," Coach Anderson said, his voice rough but commanding. "The lights aren't turning off properly. The electricians are off for the weekend, and I don't want to leave the place looking like a haunted house." Marcus sighed, already exhausted from the game and the night, but nodded. "Fine, Coach. I'll be right back." He walked through the darkened parking lot, the headlights of a few remaining cars casting long shadows on the pavement. The stadium lights, which should have been switched off hours ago, still hummed faintly in the distance. As he walked closer, he noticed that the sound of his footsteps on the gravel seemed oddly muffled, like the ground was absorbing the sound. When he reached the gate, it was already open, which struck him as odd. The groundskeeper, Mr. Thompson, was usually meticulous about locking up at night, but it was clear that no one had bothered to do so tonight. Shrugging it off, Marcus entered the stadium and walked toward the field. The air was cool, crisp, and carried with it the faint smell of grass and damp earth. He stood still for a moment, taking in the empty stands, the silent goalposts, and the glow of the lights that cast long shadows across the turf. He found the light switch in the small shack at the edge of the field, located behind the end zone. He flicked the switch down, but the lights didn't respond. He tried again, but the lights remained stubbornly on, their glow eerie and unnatural. Stupid lights. Marcus muttered under his breath, frustration creeping into his voice. He stepped outside the shack, thinking that maybe the switch itself was malfunctioning. But as he turned to walk back toward the field, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving against the backdrop of the stadium. But no, it was something else, something unmistakably real. At the far end of the field, just beyond the 50-yard line, he saw a figure standing still. The figure was tall, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned football uniform, its helmet glinting in the dim light. The figure wasn't moving, but something about it made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. He froze, unsure whether he was seeing things or if his mind was playing tricks on him. It was well past midnight, and he hadn't been expecting anyone else to be there. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking slightly. "Is someone out there?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to tilt its head slightly, as though considering him. Marcus took a hesitant step forward, then another. The figure still didn't move, but as Marcus approached, he could hear something, soft, faint, like the sound of a whistle. It was a low, mournful sound, echoing across the field despite the stillness of the night. Marcus stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The whistle had come from the figure. He could feel it in his bones, the air around him thickening with an unnatural chill. The world around him seemed to go silent, save for the sound of his own breath, harsh and quick in the stillness. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but instead it began to slowly move toward him. Its steps were measured, deliberate, as though it was walking through water. Each footfall was heavy, dragging as if the ground itself was holding it back. Marcus's pulse quickened. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the earth. The closer the figure got, the more Marcus could make out its details. The old-fashioned helmet, the faded number on the jersey, the tattered pants. But it wasn't just the uniform that was strange, it was the way the figure moved. It was as though it wasn't quite human, as though its body wasn't fully there. Suddenly, the figure stopped, just a few yards away from Marcus. And then, with a suddenness that made Marcus gasp, it spoke. You should have been here," it rasped, its voice echoing in Marcus's mind. "You should have been here that night. You should have saved me." Marcus staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. What do you mean? Who are you?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it seemed to look down, its head tilting to the sides, as if it were trying to remember something. Then, without warning, it lunged toward Marcus. A sharp, searing pain exploded in his chest as the figure collided with him. He gasped, unable to breathe, as he felt his body slam into the ground. His vision blurred, the world spinning, but he could still hear the whistle, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to pierce his very soul. As Marcus struggled to breathe, he felt something cold wrap around him, like the embrace of death itself. The figure loomed above him, its presence suffocating, its eyes empty, like two hollow sockets staring into the abyss. "You could have saved me," it whispered again, its voice now a soft, mournful sigh, "but you weren't there." Marcus's vision went black, and the world around him faded into nothing. When he awoke, he was lying on the cold, damp turf, the stadium lights still casting their eerie glow over the field. His body ached, every muscle sore, but there was no sign of the figure. No trace of its presence. Marcus sat up slowly, his head spinning. He looked around the empty field, the stands, the goalposts, but there was nothing there. Only the soft rustling of wind in the trees and the distant chirp of crickets. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone on that field. The figure had been real. It had been someone or something from the past, a player who had died long ago, someone who had never made it off that field. As Marcus stood up and staggered toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The chill in the air seemed to linger, and in the distance he could still hear the faint echo of a whistle. It was a sound he would never forget. And he knew, deep down, that he would never return to that field again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The bleachers were empty, but the sound of a game still echoed through the quiet stadium. The crisp fall air whipped through the stands, carrying with it the faint scent of turf and rain. The lights above the field flickered momentarily before settling into a steady hum, casting long, jagged shadows across the grass. Danny Mitchell, a junior at Stone Valley High, sat in the stands, watching the last of the lights being turned off for the night. His coach had asked him to stick around after practice to clean up, a task that usually took no more than half an hour. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him from the darkened corners of the stadium. "Probably just tired," Danny muttered to himself as he slung the last of the water bottles into the trash bin. But even as he said it, he couldn't quite convince himself. It had been a rough season. Stone Valley's football team was on a losing streak, and the tension around school had been thick for weeks. Every game seemed like another chance for the team to prove themselves, and each time they fell short. Coach Carter had been pushing them harder than ever, desperate for a win. Danny had never seen his coach so frustrated, so on edge, but something was bothering Danny even more than the losing streak. There were rumors about the field, whispers among the team about strange occurrences during late practices, flickering lights, unexplained noises in the empty locker room, the feeling of being watched when no one else was around. It wasn't the kind of thing Danny usually paid attention to, but tonight, as he lingered in the dark stadium, he couldn't ignore the gnawing unease crawling up his spine. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but it was no use. He had heard the stories before, the tales of a ghost that haunted the field, a figure that appeared after dark, watching the players, guiding them, or maybe punishing them. Some said it was the spirit of a former player who had died during a game years ago. Others claimed it was the ghost of a coach who had drowned in a tragic accident. The stories were just that, stories. At least, that's what Danny had always told himself. But tonight, as he looked out at the empty field, he wasn't so sure. He grabbed his bag and started walking toward the exit, but before he could reach the gate, he heard a sound, soft at first, like a whistle carried on the wind. It was so faint that he almost dismissed it. But then it came again, louder this time, and closer. A chill ran down his spine. Danny stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He turned toward the field, but there was no one in sight. Just the empty bleachers and the empty field, stretching out under the flickering lights. "Hello?" Danny called out, his voice trembling slightly. No response, just the wind. "Come on, Danny, get it together," he muttered to himself. It was probably just another player from the team messing with him. He'd heard about the pranks some of the guys pulled when they had a little too much time on their hands. Maybe someone had stayed behind to play a prank. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something move. It was just a flash at first, a shadow darting across the field, but it was enough to make his heart race. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but all he could see was the blur of movement, too fast, too fluid, like a figure sprinting across the turf in the dead of night. He stood frozen, staring into the dark, but the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the faint echo of a whistle lingering in the air. "Okay, that's it," Danny said, his voice now shaking. "I'm out." He turned to leave, but something stopped him. A cold gust of wind, sharp and biting, swept across the field, making him shiver. He turned back to the stands, his instincts telling him to run, but his legs refused to move. It was then that he saw it, standing at the far end of the field near the goalposts. A figure, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned football gear. It was as though the figure had stepped out of another time, the uniform faded and worn, the helmet dark and tarnished. The figure was standing perfectly still, staring directly at him. Danny's heart thudded in his chest. He knew he should turn and run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. He tried to call out, but no words came. His mouth felt dry, like he couldn't speak, even if he wanted to. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. The faint sound of a whistle pierced the air again, but this time it was clearer, closer, as though it was coming from the figure itself. And then, in the silence that followed, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the figure took a step forward, then another. The whistle echoed again, followed by the sound of cleats scraping against the turf. Danny's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to cross the field, its pace quickening, closing the distance between them. No, this isn't happening," Danny whispered to himself, backing away slowly, his legs still unwilling to obey. He tried to turn, but it felt as though something was holding him in place. His chest tightened and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. The figure was getting closer, its footsteps almost deafening now. Danny's mind raced. He had to do something, anything, to get out of here. He wasn't supposed to be scared, but everything about this felt wrong. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. The figure stopped just a few feet from him, standing still in the middle of the field. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Danny's mind screamed at him to run, but the words were stuck in his throat. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. And then, as if it was reading his thoughts, the figure raised its arm, pointing at him with a gloved hand. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp, like the whisper of the wind through dry leaves. "You should have been here," it said, its voice sending a shiver down Danny's spine. "You should have been here when it happened." Danny's heart skipped a beat. What was it talking about? What had happened? The figure took another step closer, and this time, Danny could see the faded number on its jersey. The numbers were illegible, worn away by time, but there was no mistaking the emblem on the shoulder. The same emblem worn by every player on the team. The figure was wearing the uniform of a Stone Valley player, a player who had been killed in a car accident years ago, right after his last game. The same player whose tragic death had haunted the team for years. "Get out of here," Danny shouted, his voice breaking. He finally found his voice, his legs suddenly no longer frozen. He turned and ran toward the gate, not looking back, not caring if he tripped or fell. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that figure, from whatever it was. He didn't stop until he reached the parking lot, his chest heaving, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He glanced back at the stadium, but there was nothing there. No figure, no sign of movement. The lights were off now, and the field was empty once again. But Danny knew. He knew that what he had seen was real. He wasn't crazy. The ghost of the player, the one who had died so many years ago, still haunted the field, still waited for someone to acknowledge what had happened, to remember the tragedy. The next day, Danny tried to brush it off. He told himself it was just a trick of the mind, the result of too many late nights and too much pressure. But as the weeks passed, the memory of that ghost lingered. And as the next football season approached, with it came a sense of unease, a feeling that Danny couldn't shake. He knew the stories. He knew the ghost wouldn't leave the field until someone truly understood what had happened. Until someone could make peace with the past. And as the new season began, he couldn't help but wonder who would be next to encounter the ghost of Stone Valley's past. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The wind howled through the empty stands of the old stadium, sending gusts of cold air across the worn-out bleachers. It was a late autumn evening, the sky a deep, almost black shade of purple, with only the faintest hint of light from the half-moon above. The stadium was deserted as it had been for years, except for a few scattered leaves that skittered across the cracked pavement, pushed by the breeze. This was the home of the Kingsley Tigers, the high school football team that had once been the pride of their town, long before the school was forced to shut down. It had been over a decade since the last game had been played here, but the field and the stadium still stood, forgotten by most of the town, save for a few people who couldn't bear to let go of the memories. Jared Harris wasn't one of those people, at least not until tonight. He had always known about the stadium's history. Everyone in Kingsley had heard the stories about the strange occurrences, the whispers about ghosts, and the mysterious happenings surrounding the team. But Jared, a sophomore at Kingsley High School, had never believed in such things. He had grown up hearing about the haunted field, but he thought it was just a bunch of old legends and exaggerated tales from the older generations. After all, he was an athlete, a football player. Superstition had no place in his life. But all that changed one fateful evening, when he was asked to do something he had never done before. It started with a simple request from his coach, Coach Daniels. The team had just wrapped up their practice for the season. The game was in a few days, and they were trying to squeeze in every last bit of preparation before the big match. The team had been struggling for years, and this was their best shot at winning the state championship. "Jared, I need you to go check something at the field," Coach Daniels had said after practice one evening, his voice unusually low. "There's something weird with the lights. I want you to go make sure they're turned off after everyone leaves." Jared didn't think twice. It wasn't like he had anything else planned, and the old stadium was just a short walk from the locker rooms. He told his teammates he'd catch up with them later and made his way to the stadium. The gate creaked as he opened it, the sound of rusted metal scraping against itself sending a shiver up his spine. It was strange to be there after hours, alone. The field, which usually had the hum of activity, was silent now, save for the occasional rustle of wind and the far-off cry of a bird. The floodlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. He stepped onto the field, feeling the familiar grip of the grass beneath his cleats, but something felt off. The air was colder than it had been during practice, almost unnaturally so, and the ground was damp, even though there had been no rain that day. Jared made his way over to the light switch at the far side of the field, next to the bleachers. As he approached, he noticed a strange, low hum coming from the light fixtures above. He stopped, momentarily distracted by the sound. It was a soft, almost electronic buzzing noise, like something was malfunctioning. But there was something else in the air, something intangible. It wasn't until he reached the switch that he heard the sound again. A whistle, low and shrill, cutting through the wind. At first, he thought it was a trick of the mind, perhaps someone else was still around. But when he turned, he saw no one. The field was completely empty. "Probably just an animal," he muttered to himself, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling that was creeping up his spine. He flicked the switch, but the lights didn't respond. They remained on, casting their eerie glow across the field. He tried again. Nothing. The hum from the lights grew louder, almost deafening now, and the whistle came again, this time louder and clearer, as though it was coming from just behind him. He spun around, but still saw nothing. Jared's breath quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. His heart pounded in his chest. He had heard about the strange things that had happened at this stadium, but he had never believed them. And yet, tonight, with no one else around, it felt real. It felt like something was waiting for him, something unseen, but very much present. The wind picked up again, swirling around the field, as if trying to drive him away. He looked up at the lights once more, and that's when he saw it. A shadow, moving across the field. At first, it was just a silhouette against the backdrop of the bleachers. Then it became clearer. A figure in a football uniform, running across the turf, swift and sure-footed. Jared froze, his eyes locked on the figure. It wasn't possible. The figure wasn't just running. It was sprinting with the same intensity he had seen in his teammates during the games, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The figure didn't slow down. It didn't seem to tire. It was fast, faster than any human could run. As Jared watched in horror, the figure turned toward him, and for a brief moment their eyes met, those hollow, empty eyes that stared at him with a chilling intensity. Jared's blood ran cold. The figure's face was obscured by a helmet, but the intensity of its gaze, even behind the mask, made Jared's stomach twist. Before he could react, the figure disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The whistle sounded again, and this time it was louder, sharper. The cold was unbearable now. Jared didn't wait to see what happened next. Without thinking, he turned and ran, his cleats pounding against the turf, his breath ragged in his chest. He didn't stop until he was back at the gate, nearly tripping over his feet in his haste to leave. He slammed the gate shut behind him and leaned against it, gasping for air. His hands shook violently, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When he finally managed to catch his breath, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. He stared into the dark, trying to steady his breathing, but the figure was gone. Yet, the air still felt charged, as though something was lingering. The whistle echoed faintly, just out of reach, like a distant memory. That night, Jared didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his room, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, that he had been tired and overworked. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. The next day, he told no one, keeping the experience to himself. But as the days passed, the whispers around school started to grow louder. People began to talk about the strange things happening at the stadium. The lights malfunctioning, the sound of whistles echoing through the night, strange shadows moving across the field when no one was around. The stories about the ghost of the Kingsley Tigers' old star player, a boy who had died in a car crash just days after leading the team to a state championship victory years ago, began to surface once again. The ghost was said to haunt the field, appearing to players who didn't respect the game, or sometimes just to remind them of the legacy they were a part of. Jared couldn't shake the image of the figure he had seen that night. He knew that the ghost was real, but he didn't know why it had chosen to show itself to him, or what it wanted. The only thing he knew for sure was that the stadium was no longer just a place for games. It had become a place where the past lingered, waiting to make itself known. As the season continued, Jared's performance on the field began to suffer. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost of the stadium was watching him, pushing him harder, demanding more. And sometimes late at night, when he walked past the field, he would hear the faintest sound of a whistle, followed by the soft, steady thumping of footsteps running across the turf. And he knew, deep down, that the spirit of the Kingsley Tigers' past would never let him forget. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
It was a crisp fall evening when the small town of Northwood began to buzz with excitement. The high school football team was gearing up for their biggest game of the season. Northwood had been struggling in recent years, but this year they had a promising squad. The air was thick with anticipation, and the stands were packed as the game started under the bright lights. Jason Mitchell, a senior quarterback, had always dreamed of this moment. He had spent countless hours practicing, refining his skills, and trying to become the best player he could be. But for all his hard work, there was something about tonight that felt off, something he couldn't shake. Maybe it was the strange, almost oppressive chill that seemed to hang in the air. Or maybe it was the eerie silence that descended when the crowd had settled into their seats, waiting for the game to begin. The game itself was tense. Northwood's team had the ball, and Jason felt the weight of his final year bearing down on him with every throw. His teammates, all of them hungry for victory, were equally determined to make it happen. They were on the edge of greatness, and they knew it. Midway through the second quarter, however, something unexpected happened. Jason dropped back to pass, his eyes scanning the field for an open receiver. He felt the rush of the defense bearing down on him, but just as he was about to throw, a sharp, cold breeze whipped through the air. It was so sudden that it made him stumble. He faltered for a moment, but it wasn't enough to stop the ball. His pass sailed through the air, but just before it reached his wide receiver, the lights above the field flickered. The crowd gasped in surprise as the ball mysteriously veered off course, spiraling into the hands of an opponent. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't explain what had just happened. There was no wind, no physical force that could have caused that pass to go awry. It was as though the very air around him had conspired against him. The crowd was silent, and for a moment, Jason felt a chill run down his spine. After the interception, Northwood's defense struggled to recover. The opposing team took full advantage, scoring a touchdown in a matter of minutes. Jason's mind raced as he tried to understand what had gone wrong. The strange feeling of unease grew stronger, gnawing at him. As the game continued, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He looked up at the towering bleachers, scanning the crowd, but there was no one there who seemed out of place. It was as though an unseen presence was hovering over the field, lurking just beyond the lights. It wasn't until halftime, when Jason made his way to the locker room, that the odd occurrences escalated. The locker room was dimly lit, and the sound of the players' chatter filled the space. But Jason, still rattled from the interception, found it hard to focus. He sat down on a bench, trying to steady his breathing, when he felt something cold brush against his cheek. It was a fleeting sensation, but enough to send a shiver through him. He turned to look, but there was no one behind him. The air was still, and the room was silent. "Hey man, you all right?" asked Luke, one of his teammates. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jason forced a smile, trying to brush off the strange feeling. "Yeah, just a little shaken. I'll be fine." Luke gave him a concerned look, but didn't press further. The team had a game to finish. The coaches rallied the players, reminding them that they still had a chance to turn things around. But for Jason, the night's events had only just begun. The second half started with a renewed energy, but it quickly became clear that something was off. Every time Jason touched the ball, something felt wrong. His throws were off target, and he found himself stumbling over his own feet. His team was falling apart, and despite his best efforts, he couldn't seem to shake the feeling that there was something or someone actively sabotaging him. Then, in the fourth quarter, the strangest thing happened. Jason was lined up for a critical play, a chance to win the game for Northwood. He stood in the huddle, his heart pounding in his chest. The field was alive with energy as the clock ticked down. He called out the play, and as he took his position behind center, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A whisper. Soft at first, then growing louder, the words carried on the wind, swirling around him. It was unintelligible, like a distant murmur in the back of his mind. He shook his head, trying to focus, but the whispering continued. He glanced over at his teammates, but they didn't seem to hear it. "Jason, snap the ball," shouted his center, but Jason couldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the sensation of something watching him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. Suddenly, he was no longer on the field. He was standing in the middle of an empty stadium, the stands dark and silent. The lights above him flickered, casting long shadows across the grass. He turned around, and standing at the far end of the field was a figure. A man, dressed in an old-fashioned football uniform, his face obscured by a shadow. Jason's heart raced as the figure took a step toward him. He tried to move, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure's footsteps echoed in the silence as he drew closer, until he was standing right in front of Jason. "Help me," the figure whispered, his voice rough and haunting. "Help me finish the game." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure's eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the air around him. The man's uniform was old, faded, as though it had been left to rot for decades. Jason tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was paralyzed by fear, caught in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The figure reached out a hand, cold and clammy, and placed it on Jason's shoulder. The touch was enough to send a shock through his body. Jason gasped and stumbled backward, but the figure didn't move. He stood there, staring into Jason's soul with those empty eyes. "You have to finish the game," the figure whispered again, the words reverberating in Jason's mind. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision faded. Jason was back on the field, the roar of the crowd filling his ears. His hands were shaking, and his chest felt tight with panic. But the worst part was that the whispering was still there, faint but persistent, echoing in his mind. The next play began, and Jason, still disoriented, took the snap. This time, he could hear the whispering even more clearly. It was as if the figure was guiding him, pushing him to make a decision he didn't understand. He saw his wide receiver break free from the defense, and in a moment of clarity, he threw the ball. The pass was perfect. The receiver caught it and ran the final few yards into the end zone, scoring a touchdown. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Jason barely heard it. His mind was still reeling from what had just happened. Had it all been in his head? Or had something more sinister been at play? The game ended with Northwood claiming victory, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the strange encounter was far from over. As he walked off the field, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, an old, weathered football lying in the middle of the field. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up, feeling its rough surface beneath his fingers. There was a name engraved on the ball, Charlie Thompson. He didn't recognize the name, but it sent a chill down his spine. Later that night, Jason went home, trying to put the strange events out of his mind. But the next morning, he couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the whispering, and the ball. He decided to do some research, hoping to find answers. After hours of digging through old records and newspaper clippings, he uncovered a chilling story. Charlie Thompson had been a star player for Northwood High back in the 1920s. He had been the quarterback, just like Jason, and he had led his team to a critical game that was supposed to secure their place in the state finals. But during the final play, something went wrong. Charlie had thrown the ball, but it had missed its target, and the team had lost the game. After the game, Charlie had disappeared, never to be seen again. It was rumored that he had vanished into the night, consumed by the weight of his failure. Jason's heart sank as he read the story. The ghostly figure on the field, the whispering, the football with Charlie's name, everything began to make sense. Charlie Thompson had never left the field. He had been trapped in the game, unable to rest until his final play had been completed. Jason had finished Charlie's game. He had made the perfect throw, the one that Charlie had been unable to complete so many years ago, and in doing so, he had freed the restless spirit from his torment. That night, as Jason lay in bed, the whispering finally stopped. It was as if the weight of the past had been lifted, and in the silence, he could almost hear the faint sound of a football bouncing on the field, as if the game had truly come to an end. Story. The end.
Story number 8.
It was an unusually warm evening for early October, but the humid air hung thick around the football field as the last remnants of the sun dipped below the horizon. The stadium lights flickered on with their usual hum, casting a faint glow over the deserted field. The bleachers, once filled with the loud cheers of a full house, now stood silent and empty, their rusted bolts creaking occasionally with the wind. There was a strange quiet in the air, an unsettling one that sent a shiver down Jesse Carter's spine. Jesse was no stranger to hard work and long hours on the field. He'd been a part of the team at Jefferson High for the past 3 years, and this final season was supposed to be a chance to prove themselves. They'd been struggling, but they had one more shot at the district championships. Tonight, however, Jesse was not focused on the championship. He was there for an entirely different reason. He had been asked to stay late after practice to do a routine check of the field. It wasn't the first time his coach, Coach Miller, had always been strict about keeping the grounds in order. Tonight, however, felt different. The air was thick with a sense of unease that Jesse couldn't quite shake off. He pushed it down, telling himself it was just nerves. He grabbed the trash bags filled with water bottles from the locker room and made his way across the field, his cleats tapping on the hard, worn-out turf as he walked toward the trash cans near the far end. The field was still damp from the afternoon rain, and every footstep echoed through the empty stands, bouncing off the steel structure of the bleachers. As he tossed the last of the bags into the trash bin, Jesse couldn't help but glance up at the lights. They had been flickering on and off throughout practice, but it hadn't been anything to be concerned about. Electrical issues were common for the aging stadium. Still, as the lights above buzzed and hummed, there was something about the sound that was off. It didn't sound like an ordinary malfunction. It was as if something was trying to get his attention. "Maybe I'm just overthinking this," he muttered to himself, rubbing his neck. But something tugged at him. He couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching him. He turned around, half expecting to see a teammate walking down from the locker room or one of the other coaches, but no one was there. The stands were empty, save for the shadows cast by the flickering lights. Jesse took a deep breath and turned back to the field, deciding to finish up quickly and leave. As he began to walk toward the gate, he felt a sudden cold draft. He paused, feeling the chill run down his spine. The temperature had been warm just moments before, but now a frigid gust of wind swept across the field, cutting through him like a knife. It made him stop in his tracks. "Jesus," he muttered, rubbing his arms to ward off the sudden chill. He shook his head, feeling foolish. He was just tired. That had to be it. But then he heard something, a low, distant sound. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. But as it grew louder, he realized it wasn't the wind. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the field. He turned toward the source of the noise, but the field was empty. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. There was no way anyone else could be out there. He had seen everyone leave. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence. But there was no response. The footsteps continued, closer now. Jesse swallowed, feeling a lump form in his throat. His instincts told him to run, to leave the field and never look back, but his legs refused to obey. His body was rooted to the spot, staring out into the field, waiting for whatever, or whoever, was coming. Then he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the field near the end zone. It was tall and lean, dressed in an old, tattered uniform. The helmet obscured the face, but Jesse could see the glint of what looked like old, worn-out pads, the type they no longer used in modern football. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring in his direction. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't possible. No one had been out there when he had last checked. He took a step back, his breath shallow as panic set in. His mind raced. Was this some kind of prank? Or was it... The figure slowly started walking toward him, its steps heavy and deliberate, the sound of cleats scraping against the turf making his skin crawl. Jesse felt his stomach twist into knots. Something wasn't right. The air felt charged, as if some presence was bearing down on him. As the figure drew closer, Jesse's legs finally moved. He turned and sprinted toward the gate, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in sharp, panicked bursts as he ran. But as he reached the gate, it was as if something held him back. His hand went to the latch, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. Come on! Come on!" he yelled, tugging at the gate, but it wouldn't open. He turned back to look, but the figure was gone. He looked left and right, but there was no sign of it. Just the empty field and the faint hum of the lights above. Still breathing heavily, Jesse slammed his fist against the gate, cursing under his breath. The gate finally gave way, creaking open with a loud protest. He didn't look back as he hurried toward his car, the lights from the stadium flashing in his rearview mirror. The next morning, Jesse woke up groggy, the events from the night before playing over and over in his head. Had he really seen something on the field, or had he just been imagining it? He wasn't sure, but the image of the ghostly figure lingered in his mind, haunting him. At school, he tried to push it to the back of his mind. After all, he had a game to focus on. But as he walked through the hallways, he overheard snippets of conversation, other players talking about strange occurrences on the field. A few of his teammates mentioned hearing whispers in the locker room late at night. Others said they had seen shadows moving on the sidelines during late practices. It was as if the stadium had come alive with a presence no one could explain. Jesse tried to laugh it off, but deep down, the unease was growing. Something had happened on that field. He could feel it in his bones. The rumors about the stadium's haunted past were not just stories. They were real. That Friday night, the air was thick with anticipation. The stands were packed, and the roar of the crowd filled the stadium, but Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The game went on as expected. The opposing team was tough, but Jesse and his teammates were holding their ground. It wasn't until the third quarter, when they were leading by a touchdown, that Jesse noticed something in the corner of his eye. A shadow on the field, a figure standing just beyond the end zone. He could feel his heart rate spike. "Not again," he whispered under his breath. This time he wasn't imagining it. He could see the figure clearly, tall, wearing a helmet, his old uniform tattered at the edges. It was there, watching him. Jesse's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The crowd, the game, all of it. He was locked in on that figure, unable to look away. It was as if time had stopped. The whistle blew. The play was over. His teammates were celebrating, but Jesse barely heard them. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the ghost on the field. After the game, Jesse returned to the locker room, his thoughts racing. He couldn't explain what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain: the ghost of the stadium was real. And it had something to do with the team, with the history of the place. Later that evening, he found an old photograph in the school's archives, an image of a football team from decades ago. The players in old-fashioned uniforms were all smiling, posing for the camera. But one face stood out, the figure from the field, the ghost. It was him, staring back from the photograph, his face cold and unblinking. Jesse was staring at the ghost of the team's forgotten past. From that day on, the team's fortunes changed. They went on to win the championship, but Jesse could never forget the figure that haunted the field. And every time he stepped onto that turf, he knew the spirit was watching, guiding them from the shadows. And as long as the lights flickered above the field, the ghost would never truly leave. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The cool autumn air clung to the dampness of the field as I jogged the sideline, keeping my eye on the coach's instructions. The big game was only a few days away, and the tension was palpable. This was my last season of high school football, and I was the starting quarterback for Oak Ridge High. The pressure was on, but for some reason it felt heavier tonight. There was something about this field, something about this game that made it all seem different. Old Mill Stadium was legendary in our town, a relic of the past. It had seen countless games, champions crowned, and heartbreak suffered. But it also carried something darker, a history that many players whispered about but never dared to investigate. People said the stadium was haunted by the ghost of a former player, Zachary Miller, who died under mysterious circumstances during a scrimmage many years ago. The story was tragic and unclear. Some said he collapsed from a heart attack, others that something darker took place, but no one could say for sure. Whatever the reason, Zachary's name still echoed through the halls of Oak Ridge High, and many players swore they'd heard footsteps in the locker room late at night when the building was supposed to be empty. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But as I took my place on the sideline that night, a strange unease washed over me. The crowd was loud, buzzing with energy, but there was a certain stillness in the air. The lights, bright and stark, cast shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond the field, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees surrounding the stadium. I was used to it by now, but tonight felt different. I tried to push it aside. I glanced toward the bleachers and noticed a lone figure sitting near the top, silhouetted against the bright stadium lights. He was dressed in an old, faded jacket and cap, looking like he didn't belong there. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something odd about the way he sat, so still, so motionless, that it unnerved me. I turned away, shaking off the sensation. It wasn't the first time I had felt something strange at Old Mill Stadium, but I'd always written it off as superstition. But tonight was different. The game began, and I focused on my role, throwing passes, running plays, doing everything I could to keep us in the lead. We were up against Millfield High, our biggest rival, and the tension in the air was thick. But even as I led the team, a part of me couldn't shake the unease that had settled in. I kept glancing toward the stands, expecting to see that figure again. But the seats were empty now, and the crowd was too caught up in the action to notice anything else. It wasn't until halftime that things took a turn. I was standing by the bench, chatting with some of the guys, when I noticed one of our coaches walking toward me. Coach Thompson was the type to keep his distance during games, but when he approached, I could tell something was wrong. "Hey kid, you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost anxious. "Yeah, just trying to stay focused," I replied, giving him a half smile. "Why?" Coach Thompson looked over his shoulder, scanning the field. "It's just, I've been hearing things. There's been talk about strange noises around the locker rooms, whispers, footsteps. You might want to stay out of there tonight." I tried to laugh it off. "It's just nerves. The guys are probably hearing things." He didn't seem convinced. "Yeah, maybe. But I'm telling you, I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something more. I had heard the rumors, stories about the old quarterback, Zachary Miller, whose life had ended on that very field. They said his spirit had never left, and some players swore they had seen him or at least felt his presence during practices late at night. But again, I brushed it off. Ghost stories were just that, stories. I was wrong. The second half began, and I tried to focus, trying to ignore the strange pull in my chest, the tingling sensation that seemed to grow the longer I stood on the field. Every time I glanced toward the sideline, I caught glimpses of something moving in the shadows, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. The game was fast-paced, but it wasn't long before I felt something cold, something oppressive, settle on me. The play called for a quick pass to the tight end, and I called the signal, moving into position. But as I released the ball, everything seemed to slow down. The air became thick, and the entire stadium seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if time itself was warping. I watched in slow motion as the ball left my hands, spinning through the air. And then, out of nowhere, a shadow darted across the field, too fast for any human to move. The ball dropped short of my receiver and hit the turf with a thud. The crowd gasped, and I stood frozen for a moment, my heart hammering. I turned to look at the sideline, and that's when I saw it, the man in the stands. But now he wasn't sitting. He was standing at the very top, leaning over the railing, his face no longer obscured by shadows. His eyes were dark, hollow, and the moment they locked onto mine, a chill ran through me. His lips didn't move, but I could hear him in my head, faintly whispering, "Leave." I couldn't breathe. My legs turned to lead, and I struggled to regain control of my senses. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice the figure. The crowd was oblivious. My teammates were focused on the game, but I could see him clearly now, standing there like a phantom, his face twisted with anguish and fury. I felt myself drawn to him, and my body refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away. The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent. "Leave. Leave, or you'll join me." Suddenly, I snapped back into my body. The stadium lights flickered, and I could hear the coach's voice cutting through the air, snapping me out of my trance. "Call the play! Now!" My hands were shaking as I called the next play, trying to push everything out of my mind. But it was hard. The figure in the stands hadn't disappeared. It was there, watching, waiting. As I led the team through the next series of downs, my mind kept returning to him. I tried to block out the fear, the dread, but it was getting harder to focus. With only a minute left on the clock, we were tied. The pressure was mounting, and I knew this could be my last chance to lead the team to victory. I called the play, my heart racing in my chest. But as I dropped back to pass, the air grew unnaturally cold. The field lights flickered again, and I saw it. Zachary Miller's face, pale and twisted in the reflection of my helmet. I couldn't stop. I had no choice. I released the ball, and for a moment, it felt like everything was moving in slow motion. The world around me faded to black, and the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the whisper in my ear, the voice now more forceful than ever. "Leave." But just before the ball reached the receiver, the figure in the stands moved. He stepped down from the railing, walking toward the field with long, slow strides. His feet didn't touch the ground, they seemed to float just above the grass. And with one final burst of energy, I threw the ball. It landed in my receiver's hands. The crowd went wild, erupting into cheers as we won the game. But I didn't celebrate. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The figure in the stands was gone. But I knew he hadn't really left. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I saw a ghost or if the pressure of the game just got to me. But when the final whistle blew and the team celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that Zachary Miller had been there on the field, guiding my arm, steering me toward that last pass. After the game, I didn't return to the locker room with the team. I couldn't. I was too afraid to go near the field again. I told my coaches I had to leave early, and I drove home without speaking to anyone. That night, I didn't sleep. The image of that man in the stands haunted me. His hollow eyes burned into my mind. I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't just nerves. Old Mill Stadium wasn't just a place where games were played. It was a place where something darker lingered. And as I left Oak Ridge High behind, I couldn't escape the feeling that something of Zachary Miller's spirit had stayed on that field. Story the end.